Hi, and welcome back to day 3 of this Synapse video series on eccentric training. I'm really glad you could be here. Now, over the past couple days, we've covered a fair bit of ground on eccentric overload training in particular, and how that's distinct from commonly practiced eccentric training. We took a look at the huge list of benefits that eccentric overload training offers, as well as some of the pitfalls and dangers that are associated with trying to engage with that type of training. And then on day 2, we took a deeper dive and explored how conventional training falls short when trying to fully stimulate all 3 phases of movement. The Synapse removes those obstacles and goes beyond the limits of conventional training and unlocks true eccentric overload training. So if you didn't have a chance to check out the videos from day 1 and day 2, I'd encourage you to do so now because that's going to help inform our discussion going forward. So today, I'd like to discuss training as a concept, sort of in its most basic and pure form. If we decide to train anything, essentially we're looking for an adaptation or a change. Now, that adaptation could be anything, like I want to be able to run faster so I can excel at my sport, or I just like to be a little bit more fit and healthy, to maybe you want to get better grades or learn how to play the guitar. But all of these things require a change from the current state. And to get that adaptation, we apply a stimulus. So that essentially is training when it's boiled down to its bare essence. It's applying a stimulus to get a given adaptation. Now, our job as coaches, trainers, teachers, PTs, and even individuals is to figure out what the stimulus is that's necessary to get that adaptation that we're after. And ideally, that stimulus is efficient at getting us from point A to point B. Now, this is where the Synapse really excels because it unlocks true eccentric overload training. And as a result, it offers a very, very unique stimulus that results in a long list of adaptations that we've been over in this video series. So in this next video, we're going to look at some real data from the Synapse in use. And we're going to point out some key factors, and we'll discuss that in more depth and detail on the other side. Here's an actual graph of the Synapse 90-second set for a single leg lunge. The green line illustrates the forces produced during the exercise. First, we can note the concentric max. This is the maximum force that can be applied at the weakest joint angle, and the force that would be assessed as a 1-rep max. An often used strategy for strength programming is to take a percentage of a 1-rep max and create a protocol of reps and sets. A common practice would be to use the benchmark of 80% of a 1-rep max to calculate training loads. When applied in this instance, 107 times 0.8 equals 85.6 pounds. This weight would remain constant throughout the exercise, as represented by the blue line, and fails to match the force potential of the body. The eccentric peak is the maximum force production at the strongest joint angle during the eccentric phase. In this instance, 204 pounds is generated, a staggering 90% greater force than could be lifted concentrically. The Synapse features custom calibrated resistance, which tailors the force precisely to your ability at all times. In this instance, the result is that the Synapse allows for 44% greater force production when matched for time under tension versus conventional training. The green area above the blue line is only accessible with the Synapse. Conventional training simply cannot match the varying forces of the different phases of movement. In addition, the Synapse is far more efficient. The 90-second set systematically and thoroughly fatigues all muscle fiber types, resulting in 75% shorter workout times. The Synapse goes beyond the limits of conventional training. It creates whole new methods of training that are more effective, efficient, and safe. So in this example, the graph demonstrates that the Synapse opens the door to up to 90% greater maximal force production than could even be lifted concentrically with traditional weights. And because the Synapse features custom calibrated resistance and precisely matches the strength curve at all times, it allows for 44% increase in total force produced when matched for time against conventional training methods. So this is how the Synapse can so dramatically reduce training times. In fact, in just 25 minutes per week on the Synapse, that's enough of a stimulus to get the same or greater adaptations of hours in the gym. And despite the fact that the forces generated on the Synapse are substantially greater, because it continually adapts to your ability level, it greatly reduces the risk of injury. We've now seen that the Synapse unlocks true eccentric overload training and provides a stimulus that is extremely unique. That's why so many pro athletes, pro sports teams, physical therapists, and trainers are all employing the Synapse to elevate performance. Now, because the Synapse can challenge virtually any force vector, there are a wide variety of applications. Those applications generally fall into four main categories. The first of which is super time-efficient strength training that's safe. And we've spent a fair bit of time discussing that already. Category number two is activations and recovery. Now here, Major League Baseball pitchers are a great example. Traditionally, it would take 20 to 30 minutes for these athletes to warm up their shoulders, arms, and bodies to be ready to throw. And now, they can go through an activation protocol on the Synapse that takes just 3 minutes, and they're ready to throw at full capacity. So the time savings is absolutely immense. And in addition, they can do just a handful of moves at the end of a game or a training session to ensure that they recover well and that they can pitch effectively for an entire season. So let's take a look at a video now that explores some of the options for overhead throwing athletes on the Synapse. So we know that for all throwing sports, whether it be baseball, football quarterbacks, or even tennis players with overhead throwing service motions, it's super important to take care of the posterior chain of the shoulder. It's responsible for decelerating all the forces that we create when we're hitting that fast serve or throwing a fastball or throwing a 60-yard touchdown pass. So it's really important that we take care of that. And if we don't take care of that, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to have a governor put on how much acceleration force you can put into the ball or the racket, or, and athletes are really good at this, they're going to compensate and find a way to break through that and end up with potentially an overuse injury or unfortunately something more serious. So one of the methods that is often used to address the posterior chain of the shoulder is a Y movement with the band. Now, bands are great for a lot of things, but in this instance, they fall short of being able to fully and maximally load the eccentric phase of movement here. And unfortunately, the force vector at the top here is all wrong, as I need to be absorbing forces going forward at that point in time. So another strategy to try and prepare the shoulder for the massive forces that it needs to be able to handle when throwing or serving is to do reverse throws ballistically with some sort of plyo ball. Now, if we look at what's happening there, it's actually a concentric contraction of the posterior chain, which means the muscles are actually shortening. Now, studies have shown us that the transfer from concentric to eccentric movements is actually quite poor. And so there's not a lot of translation into being able to decelerate forces from that movement. So let's take a look at how we can address this issue with the Synapse. It has the unique ability to maximally overload the eccentric phase of movement during that throwing or pitching movement. So I can get in this position, and if you notice, the force vector is down and forward, and I'm going to be resisting that downward pull by pulling my shoulder up and back to resist that movement. So as I do that, I'm going to stand up and pull the control strap across. As you can see, my shoulder is being pulled down and across my body, just as it would be in a throw. So the force vector changes from forward on my shoulder to around the back of my body, which is very analogous to when I throw or serve. So this allows us to fully and eccentrically load that phase of movement and concentrically to create loads on that shoulder in a way that we can't with anything else. And that's going to allow us to keep a stronger, healthier shoulder to throw faster, serve faster, and throw longer passes. The third category of application is rehab and injury prevention. Because the Synapse can adapt the resistance in really fine increments, it's very well suited to aiding in the recovery from an injury and getting back to full function. As far as injury prevention, studies have shown that just a few bouts a week of eccentric loading on the hamstrings is enough to significantly reduce hamstring injuries in elite level soccer players. So here's a video that shows just one method of eccentrically loading the hamstrings on the Synapse. Traditionally, the hamstring's targeted with a deadlift or a prone hamstring curl. We find out that actually a lot of injuries that happen during sport is when the posterior chain, the glutes and the hamstrings are on stretch and they're absorbing that eccentric force. So this exercise is designed to sort of attack that specific problem. And I get into a half kneeling position, usually with a slider underfoot. My heel is pulling back. I use the control strap to pull that open against my will, and then I'll keep pulling with that heel and reverse it. The control strap is dictating how fast and how far I actually move. That will dig deep into those hamstrings and help you prepare to absorb more forces while you're out on the athletic field. The fourth major category can broadly be labeled motor neural learning. As coaches, we spend a lot of time working with our athletes to help them become more body aware around their movements so that they can perform better. The Synapse allows us to freeze and load very specific positions. And by doing that, we can offer our athletes extremely valuable feedback on what muscles need to be active in certain positions and how the kinetic chain needs to fire to make that move efficiently. So this next video is an example of that, aimed at change of direction.
The ability to change direction is vital to high performance in virtually every sport. It's the ability to decelerate forces and absorb them and then redirect them efficiently in another direction. So whether it be in tennis, if I'm hitting a forehand on the run and I'm catching all that energy in that outside leg and then redirecting to get to the next ball, or football, maybe potentially to make a quick cut to evade a tackle or lose coverage. And it's oftentimes the difference between making a big play and scoring and winning and losing. So I wanted to share with you today one of the ways that the Synapse is very unique at being able to improve those abilities. Studies have shown that supermaximal eccentric loading is a really efficient way in small bouts to be able to improve change of direction dramatically. And one of the ways the Synapse is really unique is that we can set people up in those athletic positions and challenge them not just from a strength perspective, but also from the perspective of how they're going to organize neurologically to absorb those forces. As we may know, a lot of injuries happen in the deceleration phase of movement. So as you can see here, I've got my Synapse set up. It's anchored down and away, and I'm going to get in a position that I'm going to be absorbing with my right leg and then driving out to my left. So I can get in this position, right? And now I can suspend myself in that position. So now I can make sure that my athlete's in the position I want them to be in. And on top of that, I can actually pull myself down into that position, pull my hips down and into that leg, and really maximally overload that leg in that position, and then bring them back out. And I can freeze them at any part of that movement and have them drive with force isometrically to understand how to handle that movement. And if you've got athletes that have some compensations, for instance, they're going to drop that knee in, maybe a little bit of valgus, we can, in position, under stress, actually have them correct that, so neurologically they have a better understanding of how to decelerate that forces and be more efficient at turning them back around. So really unique way to improve the performance of your athletes with change of direction tasks with the Synapse.
Over the course of the past 3 days, we have dug into a lot of material, and it's been a real pleasure sharing that information with you. Ideally, we've shed some light on some new concepts, as well as challenging some thinking around conventional training methods. And lastly, I'd just like to express my gratitude that you would take the time to join me for this video series. It's very much appreciated.